Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Newt News Podcast. This is the first time we've talked in months when there's actual baseball activities going on. I am so excited. It's fun to stop talking about the winter, everything that's going on, and get to some on the field play, even if it's workouts, even if it's just live BP videos we're watching. It's so much better than the slow slug of the offseason. Joined by Andrew and Sandy once again, and our good friend Jeff Jones. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. How are things treating you so far in Jupiter?
So far, so good. They were soggy today. My phone told me we had like 2 inches of rain so far today, with a little more to come overnight. So it's been a pretty wet Sunday, but other than that, pretty good. Smooth sailing so far, pretty quiet. Nothing really crazy happening thus far in camp, but it's only been a week or so, so we'll give it some time, I guess.
Yeah, what does it typically look like for you, like on a typical day going in to watch the workouts and stuff? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to do each day?
Yeah, so it can vary. Broadly speaking, what happens is they open the clubhouse to us right about 8 o'clock in the morning most days. So we have an hour in the morning. Then we'll have about an hour of downtime at the end of which we'll usually get the manager for 15 minutes or so. Then they will go out, do their workout, run through the schedule, and whatever that looks like sort of depends on what they have planned for the day. So, for instance, yesterday, Saturday, there were 19 live BPs going at once. Every day there is a schedule. Actually, I have here's a good example of one sitting right behind my computer, because this is 7. Yeah, this is yesterday, so we can sort of see, right, big grid of where pitchers are going to be and where catchers are going to be, and you can see where I had sort of circled what time guys were. So like, all right, I can catch Helsley here, or do I want to go watch Ryan Fernandez? Then I went to run to see Libby. Then I went to go see Zach Thompson, but I didn't, because I went to go see Jerpy instead. Then to Granillo, and then to Riley O'Brien. So it's just, basically trying to keep track of time and watch as things go, through the day. All told, like I said, as I threw that down, they were only back on the fields working yesterday. Looks like the first thing started, they started stretching at 10, and they were back inside by noon, right? So, the workout days can go pretty quickly, even when they're getting a lot done. Owing in part to the fact that usually it's hot, it's sunny. They're trying to get these guys in and out as quickly as possible. So that ramps up as camp goes on and full squad workouts happen. They get a little longer, but with pitchers and catchers, it can be relatively compact in the morning.
Sweet. Yeah. Were there any moments where it was really tough to decide like who to go see and who to miss?
A little bit, kind of, right? Because there are things like, I haven't seen Ryan Fernandez pitch in person, right? Whereas I've seen Zach Thompson and I've seen that Lipitor pitch in person a lot. So it's a matter of, where's the best place for me to put my time here? And that was actually ultimately, why I ended up going to watch Jerpy instead of watching Thompson, right? Because I've seen Thompson a lot. I hadn't really seen Jerpy in person, maybe once, but yeah, not very often. And so I decided to hop over to see Jerpy pitch instead, and was glad I did. It was a nice little peek into kind of what makes him so tough. And frankly, it was in a spot too on one of the further back fields where the players may be a little more comfortable being a little more forthcoming kind of about opinions and stuff. And so it was interesting to hear Mason Wynn and Jordan Walker sort of talk to each other about Jerpy, right? Kind of what he was delivering to them and how they would, go about that as hitters and be able to sort of see that in real time.
That's awesome. Well, being fans, all we get are these like really short clips on social media. And so we only see one pitch from somebody's session or one excited reaction from Sonny Gray. And that's just a little preview of what we'll get into later. But what we have seen as fans are the new jerseys. And I'll say, I think they're terrible. I think a lot of other people can't stand them. Can you tell us just what's this all about? Explain to the fans back home, like, why are they changing and why are they so much worse?
So, yeah, this is the first year of the new pattern that Nike, I guess, developed and has outsourced to Fanatics to produce. I should say here more precisely that Fanatics has been actually producing the Nike branded logos for a couple of years now, right? This is just the first year of this new template that ostensibly is meant to mirror the All-Star template. And so I guess it's a thinner fabric, but it's supposed to be more wicking and it's supposed to be more athletic and blah, 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 all this stuff that I guess is good for performance. But the design changes they made to accommodate the performance look terrible, largely because the MLB logo, if you look at the back of an MLB jersey, the MLB logo is usually right at the very top of the neck, right? There's a seam that kind of runs underneath the collar. The MLB logo used to be above the seam, and then you would have the nameplate and the numbers below it. Now, because of the way that they have changed the stitching, I guess, for whatever reason, felt like the MLB logo had to be moved below that stitch. And so when that moves down, the letters get smaller and they get arched and the numbers get different. Now everyone has the exact same size numbers and nameplate on the back of their jersey, which is like, they just look bad. Like they look cheap and different and weird and bad. And I'm sure that they'll be gotten used to eventually. But I also frankly don't know what they're going to look like kind of as the season wears on and it gets hotter outside and these guys start sweating more. There was the Cardinals, because of their putting in a City Connect, had to get rid of the batting practice jersey, the spring training jerseys. And so they have been guys who have been doing, like pitchers who have been doing mound work, have been wearing their road grays out to the back, whereas pitchers who were just doing like PFPs and non-throw days had on like workout tops, right? And there have been guys who have thrown bullpens in the sun and they come out and like they're soaked and they're sweaty and you can see it through the grays and they look awful. They look really bad. So I don't know that this gets fixed. I think I know there have been some people who have been sort of idly speculating that somehow the PA is going to step in or the league is going to step in and say them to the Nike. I kind of doubt it. I kind of think it's more likely that we just probably eat it and watch it look terrible for at least a year. But they're not good. However bad they look in pictures, they look worse in person. If that makes you feel any better.
Oh my gosh,
they're bad.
They look like the giveaway jerseys. Like
they
honestly,
do.
they look
they're
like
bad.
the crappy giveaways I get. Oh, that's terrible. And honestly, I'm just glad the Cardinals don't have Jared Saltalamacchia because that would go all the way around at this point. Can you imagine?
We have not yet seen what Goldschmidt looks like in the new, so that's going to be bad enough. And I will say, as bad as they are, they could be worse, right? Because the DeWitts at least fought to maintain the chain stitching on the logo, but it's chain stitching onto a patch, which is now applied as opposed to being directly chain stitched on. It still looks a little better. The other thing the Cardinals fought against and did not have to endure was the Deadpool numbers. I don't know if you've seen this. It look kind of like basketball jerseys almost, or whatever. Like the little tiny dots that kind of make up the numbers. The Cardinals said a hard no to that as well, which is good because those also look bad. So they did, I guess, the best they could to maintain the look that they had, but you're really kind of pushing upstream on this one.
And this is just the last thing. Like, they're more expensive now too.
Apparently, yeah. Admittedly, I have not looked, but I hear that they are significantly more expensive.
Gosh, Andrew, save us.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the biggest.
Wait, we got to call Andrew real quick. Apparently, he doesn't think they look that bad.
Oh, okay. I think the font looks fine. I don't know. If they look bad in person, then they look bad in person. So,
and the thing is, there are going to be a lot of people who, like Andrew, are going to look at him and go, "Yeah, what's the big deal?" And that, I think, is probably ultimately why we end up in a place where they don't change. I think they look bad. I do think they look bad. But if 30% of people feel the way Andrew does, then they're not changing.
I mean, I'd rather have them all stitched and whatever, but I don't know. It is what it is.
You're the problem, Andrew.
Okay. Fair enough. One of the biggest storylines coming out of spring training so far has been the topic of leadership in the Cardinals clubhouse. And it was something that was addressed a little bit this past week with comments that Nolan Arenado made. So could you try to break it down for our listeners? What exactly was he trying to convey? And not to get too worked up over the new veteran additions.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that Nolan was trying to convey is a thing that we have heard from him in the past that he feels pretty strongly about, which is that he feels like if things aren't going well on the field for him, he's not in a position to go to teammates and make suggestions and be vocal from a leadership standpoint. Whether or not that's true, I guess that's to Nolan to decide, right? To me, that doesn't feel right, like that for a player of his caliber, that he would have that kind of hesitancy. But these things are personality based and they're individual, and if that's where he's at, then that's where he's at. And so the conversation when the Cardinals signed Matt Carpenter and we talked to John Mozeliak about it was really not at all about what he can do on the field, right? That was maybe a 15-20 minute presser in which there were 90 seconds of conversation about how he is going to play baseball this year. And the rest of it was sort of, look, without asking for Carpenter specifically, Goldie and Nolan kind of came right up to the edge of saying, this is the kind of guy that we need. This is the kind of guy that we want. Do what you can to bring him in. And I think, Nolan's point the other day was that having a guy like that on the roster who has gone through it, who has gone, who has been a part of winning teams before, who understands the way that maybe these guys want things done, that guy can be helpful even if he's on the bench, and maybe even especially if he's on the bench, because there is less focus on, what he is and isn't providing on the field. I will say, is that the best use of a roster spot is probably an open question. And, is that indicative of other things happening in the clubhouse that are tough to understand? Like, Nolan is talking to us about how young the clubhouse was last year. And I'm listening to him say this. That doesn't really check for me, right? Like, I'm not entirely sure that is the case. I would buy that there was maybe inexperience in that clubhouse last year, especially down the stretch when we were talking about, them just sort of trying to plug holes and get to the end of the season. And, no doubt you look at the last game of the season and it's a lot of, Lopez's and Kirakudos and Motters and guys who had been, have had more like 4A kind of progressions throughout their career. But I was a little bit surprised to hear him describe kind of the youth in the clubhouse the way that he chose to the other day.
Yeah. Do you think that's something that won't play well with some of the young guys in the clubhouse? Like, I know that's a little bit speculative, but I just kind of read that quote and it didn't feel like he kept saying in your written quote, like, hey, I'm not trying to say like they're a problem. But when you look at like guys that are spoken highly of, but then he's like, we have too much youth. I don't know. Is that something that could not play well with the young guys in the clubhouse?
So what I would say is that when younger guys talk about Nolan, they are extremely deferential and they extremely like in awe of and support of what he does on the field, right? And that sometimes you talk to a guy about an older player and you get a sense that they are like a quarter of an inch from rolling their eyes, even as they say the things that they are supposed to say. That is not the case with Nolan at all. I don't get that sense at all. So I don't think it reads that way. I also wonder, I wonder about what he considers to be a young guy. Like, he didn't want to go into the specifics of that, and I get it. I understand why. But if he is talking about the kind of, and I think Ben Frederickson has called it kind of the soft middle of the clubhouse, the guys that got sent away this offseason, right? The Hudsons, the O'Neills, the guys who've been around for a while but hadn't really done a lot, Woodford, whatever. If he's talking about those guys, I guess I get it. But even those specific personality, I don't know. There was a lot, I guess the thing to say is there was a lot of what Nolan said the other day that for me didn't check out. Like, it didn't make a lot of sense to me, but at the same time, it's not my clubhouse and there are things that happen in there when I'm not in there that I don't know anything about, right? So I have no reason not to take him at his word. But I thought it was it was an interesting window into how he felt about it, and I was pretty surprised by not only by how he felt about it, but also how willing he was to be forthcoming about how he felt about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm kind of in the same boat as you, where as I was reading through what he said, I was like, that just like kind of strange. So do you think I'm really hung up on this hesitancy thing where it's like, if Nolan's not playing well, he doesn't feel, is it, I guess, willing, or he doesn't feel like he should like go tell other players, give them adjustments? And how do you think that contributes to the type of snowball effect we saw last year?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think it's that he doesn't feel like he should, that he doesn't feel like it's proper for him or that's his place or whatever. If things are going bad for him, to tell other guys how things should be going good. Part of that, I think, is sort of the way that Nolan wears his frustration. I don't think, I think we've all sort of seen enough, even publicly, to tell that when it's not going well, he wears it and he wears it on himself, right? It's pretty visible, and sort of what you see is what you get in terms of all of that. And so I can imagine where some of that frustration would come from, in terms of him being willing / able to express himself in that way. But I also think, frankly, it in part is a consequence of not ever really having been a part of a clubhouse where he was expected to be that guy. Because you go back to Colorado, even for him, there were, I don't remember if Tulo was around or not, but like Story was around and Charlie Blackmon was around. There were guys who had kind of veteran pedigrees who handled a lot of that stuff when Nolan was in Colorado. And then he comes here in his first couple of years, Yadier Molina is around and Albert is around. The first year Carp is around, right? There are all these guys who maybe had sort of handled that in the past. And maybe he found himself kind of surprised by how much of that he was, whether it's how much he was expected to carry or at least how much the weight of it weighed on him in the way that it did.
Yeah. So going along the lines now, like moving the attention back to maybe like the Matt Carpenter signing specifically, I don't know if could you speak to a little bit what having a veteran on the bench actually does for a clubhouse? Because I think there's a little bit of the like they have Goldie, they have Arenado. Why do you need a veteran presence?
Sure.
Like, what are some of the actual things that a Carpenter could provide to the clubhouse that we can argue if it's worth the roster spot or not? But what's their line of thinking with that?
Yeah, and I think the really easy kind of comparison to draw here is when they signed Albert Pujols before the 2022 season, right? Like Matt Carpenter's not Albert Pujols, obviously. I don't think any of us are expecting him to kind of the kind of year on the field that Pujols had in 22. But if you think about that signing in spring training, that $2 million deal that very much obviously I'm just gonna, he's gonna wrap it up here and we hope it all goes well. And at the time there were a lot of people who were going, gee, what if he doesn't make the All-Star break? This could end really badly. And obviously turned out to be like an unforgettable season for him. But I think that there probably was a degree of, okay, you know what, this worked. And that was Albert in games, even games where he was DHing. It was him talking to guys on the bench, and it was younger guys kind of glomming on to him and following his workout routine. I'm sure everybody remembers lots of stories of Juan Yepes trailing behind Albert in his footsteps for as well as that workout, as it turned out. But no, you can just sort of see kind of the impact those guys have. And also, frankly, like these guys are going to kind of understand what Carp is doing there. And so if the understanding in the clubhouse is that he's a proxy almost for Goldie and for Nolan, right? If it's coming from him, it's to be understood as coming from them. That all sounds really convoluted and more complicated than it needs to be. But frankly, if those two guys aren't comfortable vocalizing, and Matt Carpenter feels like he is, or is willing to because he sort of understands his spot, then it gets their message across, maybe better than they would if they did it themselves. That at least, I guess, would be what they were hoping for.
Yeah, so you mentioned Albert and Yadi's impact on the younger players in years past, but like we've got Yadi back as some sort of advisor and Descalso as the bench coach. What difference does Matt Carpenter provide as like sort of veteran player off the bench that one of those guys couldn't do as a coach?
So yeah, I do think it's different when it's a player versus a coach, right? Because there is a layer of separation, a level of separation built into that that inherently makes it different. And Descalso is going to have responsibilities exterior to kind of bucking guys up, right? Like he's also going to have to do some of the nuts and bolts work of being a bench coach that that takes up a decent amount of time in his day. And it is different when it comes from a player versus coming from a coach. I don't know that I can pinpoint exactly why, but it for sure is. In terms of Yadier Molina, I think it remains to be seen kind of what that looks like day to day. One of the first things that we heard was that we weren't going to see him for at least a couple of weeks, that he was going to be getting to camp maybe closer to the opening of minor league camp here in a couple of weeks. So, for all their talk throughout the winter about how much time he was going to have to work with Contreras and Herrera in spring. Turns out maybe not so much. But, however much he shows up during the season, we'll sort of see what that looks like. I don't know that they maybe have a full grasp yet of what that timing is going to be like and what his level of commitment is going to be. And I think we're going to find out. I think as the year goes on, we're gonna find out how much he really wants to be around it and how involved he wants to be. And so I don't think they were in a position where they felt like they could rely on that if there were other options that they felt would sort of help them as much, or at least in a different way that they felt like they were lacking.
To kind of tie a bow in the Nolan Arenado quote side of things and the veteran leadership, one of the takes that's kind of started to gain maybe a life of its own is that this is a reflection on Oli Marmol as a manager, and that needing a veteran on the bench means you have a bad manager, so there's bad clubhouse culture. could you speak into if there's again, it's hard for us to fully know when you're, like you said, like, even with the access you have, you're not there all the time. But could you speak to like what that means? Because it feels like managers in the past have always relied on veteran leadership as well, so it's not a brand new thing. And then is there any other kind of takes or thoughts that you've seen people have about Nolan's quotes that you just want to debunk? And you're like, that's not what he's trying to say there.
So I think the thing that stands out to me is I have not seen very many people draw what I think is a very obvious line from this discussion to the situation with Ollie and Tyler O'Neill at the start of last season, which is to say that doesn't happen if it had, number one, had broad support from the rest of the clubhouse. And number two, if there wasn't a lack of people in the clubhouse that were willing to take that on themselves, right? Like, it probably is not necessary for Ollie to come to us and sort of hang Tyler O'Neill out to dry if he had maybe been checked by one of his teammates in a way that they thought was appropriate. And so, to me, more than anything else, that's what it speaks to. It's not that, it's not that Ollie Marmol created a clubhouse environment that let things go badly or, let things run out of control. Rather, it's that he was trying to manage a clubhouse environment that maybe was not as comfortable handling itself as ideally you would want it to be. And, some of those things get magnified because he is a young guy who didn't play in the big leagues. And so it's really easy for people on the outside to immediately dismiss him as a guy who doesn't know what he's talking about, or, a guy who's not plugged in, or a guy who's being a hard ass or whatever. And in reality, that's him just, I think, trying to kind of manage the situation at the time and realizing that if nobody else was going to stand up and do it, then it fell to him. I think you can still quibble with how it was done and maybe how long it was dragged out, right? But I think that to me, I think there's a really clear line, really clear path between that happening and where we're at now with how these guys are talking about what the clubhouse should and shouldn't look like.
Interesting.
Yeah, so one of the storylines coming out of camp, another one, is that the Cardinals are open to the idea of a six-man rotation to start the season. So what's the thought process behind that in the clubhouse?
So when you kind of think about the way a schedule typically looks at the start of the season, right? You typically would open on a Thursday, off Friday, play Saturday and Sunday. And they do that in the cold weather areas because you got to build in time for a rain out or a snow out so everybody can have their parades and all that stuff, right? You also maybe have more travel days typically early in the season, and you have a longer time break between when you leave spring and when and when you play your first game. The Cardinals this year have a weird situation where they do not have a scheduled off day for the first 8 days of the season because they open in LA and San Diego. It's 4 in LA, 3 in San Diego. They play a day game in San Diego on Wednesday, April 3rd, and then the home opener is the next afternoon back in St. Louis. And so it's a quick turnaround with a lot of time built in. There are also 2 games against the Cubs in Arizona on March, whatever, is it 25, 26, I guess, whatever those 2 days are, that last week of March, because they're going west to open the season. It would get a whole big fun thing to go and play the Cubs in Arizona, which is never done before in spring training. And that's all perfectly fine and interesting, but somebody's got to pitch those games, right? Like, there are literally physical innings that have to be accounted for in those. Now, can they bring, could they bring Michael McGreevy and Gordon Graceffa with them to start this? Yeah, they could, and maybe they will. But more likely, those are going to be opportunities for guys to get touches and kind of do some fine tuning. All of that is to say, typically in the first, say, 14 calendar days of a season, maybe a team has 8 games. In the first 14 calendar days of this season, the Cardinals will have something like 11 games. So when you start adding these things, you start tacking them onto the schedule, just the physical mass of innings gets a little harder to absorb. And that, I think, is where you would see the possibility of that happening, especially if either Liberatore or Thompson pitches well enough in camp to grab one of those spots that's available ostensibly in the bullpen, and they can pitch as, a sort of hybrid starter, opener, or whatever, as part of a 6-man, at least for one turn through. The other very brief thing I'll say here as well is when you look at what the Dodgers lineup looks like, they probably wouldn't hate having another lefty make a start there, right? Probably wouldn't hate it. So even if it's just one game, if either Liberatore or Thompson were to start one of those games against a lineup that includes Freeman and Ohtani, would you rather have Thompson or would you rather have Lance Lynn pitch one of those games? That's a question that they're going to have to address and figure out before they break camp.
Yeah. So that kind of rules out the possibility of adding another starter through a free agency or trade, right? That's probably off the table at this point.
I can't imagine. I understand where the desire for Jordan Montgomery comes from. I don't think it's probably healthy for people to fixate on, it's, I guess a dream is a wish your heart makes, right? I can't imagine a scenario where that happens. I don't say this as a person who quote unquote knows anything when it comes to this. I don't say this as a person who has any kind of inside information. This is just me spitballing. As soon as the Red Sox hit the number, Jordan Montgomery's going to the Red Sox. This seems very obvious to me. They have a need. His wife is a doctor at a hospital in Boston. This is not complicated. They're going to figure it out, and he's going to get there. As soon as Blake Snell gets his money, they'll take it to the Red Sox and say, "What do you got?" And Montgomery ends up there. That's me talking, spitball, and spec. That's not a report. I'm just talking. But that sure seems like the way that ends.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. It feels like the breadcrumbs to the Red Sox are all there. It's hard to put a number on it, but how likely do you think the idea is that they actually experiment the 6-man rotation for that first 8-day stretch? Or do you think it's one of those things that there's ideas that are thrown out everywhere because they have to explore every option, but at the end of the day, it's probably not that likely of a scenario, or is it just too hard to tell right now?
On February 18th, I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know who is going to be healthy on March 18th, right? And even when I say healthy, I'm talking about maybe Lynn or Matt or whoever is just a week behind in their prep, and so the season opens, and those are guys who are going to max out at 5 innings versus max out at 7. And does that change what that looks like? There are a lot of variables that still go into that. I do definitely think it's on the table again, especially if one of Thompson or Liberatore does, because there basically are 3 spots open in the bullpen, right? And if one of those 2 guys grabs one of those spots, then I think it becomes a lot more possible.
I really wish the old rules were in place where you could carry an extra pitcher if you wanted to, but you can't. Is my mic working right now? Sorry.
Yeah,
you're on. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. But I just remembered, I'm going to ask a question I asked you last year when we had our first interview with you, where we just talked about fun storylines from camp. And I remember you told us a great Jimmy Crooks story. Is there anything like that that's happened where kind of just a relatively unknown player, a little tidbit you can share with us, something to make us feel like we're down there with you?
What would have happened really early in camp? Oh, so early in camp so far. I'm trying to speed run the thing here. I guess here's one from the other day. With the pitchers who are not pitching, having their work days down there, is typically they rotate between 3 or 4 fields and go station to station, and on one they'll field pop-ups, and then on one they'll field grounders back to the mound and toss to first, and on one they'll whatever. In this case, this was a field where the bunt defense was being worked on, and Stubby Clapp is running this station, and basically you have a pitcher on the mound who's doing whatever the pitcher should be doing, and then you just have pitchers at all the other infield spots, right? So one at first, third, second, short. And they're just running through it, whatever. You feel the ball, you rotate. It looks like Little League practice, right? And they're doing this the other day, and I don't even remember who it was, but somebody, whichever pitcher was playing second base, did not cover the bag, I guess, in an adequate manner. And as Stubby Clapp starts to speak up and be like, "Hey, you got to go here on this play," Sonny Gray jumps in immediately ahead of him. And it's like, "You got to go here. This has to be," and Sonny is running the bunt defense station while participating in it, which is a pretty common theme for sort of how the Sonny Gray experience has been down here at camp so far. Far and away the most literally vocal guy I've ever heard. Maybe I have watched a lot of guys throw a bullpen in spring. I've never watched one, never heard one where the guy stands on the mound and is calling out counts, calling out pitches, and really just vocalizing his entire thought process as he goes through it. So I was not surprised to see that from Sonny, but it was still oh, this is different. It was a whole other thing.
Let's go. That's awesome. That's the type of stuff. That's the content that we all want to hear. And then just getting a little more mainstream, a little broader here. Are there any major storylines that are starting to unfold? I know, again, we're super early in the spring, and hopefully we can reconnect with you later on. But is there any big storylines, broad trends, or anything like that you're seeing?
So the short answer is no, which I think is probably what fans want to hear, because if there are big storylines at this point, it means that somebody is hurt. Right. Yeah. And that is not the case so far. In terms of camp more broadly, I do think it is pretty clear cut that there are, assuming health, there are 5 guys who are going to be in the bullpen, and that's Helsley, Gallegos, Romero, Kittredge, Middleton, which leaves 3 spots for, 3 of King, Palante, Liberatore, Thompson, O'Brien, Robertson, Fernandez. However far you want to go down the line, there are 3 spots from that group of 6 or 7 guys, right? And that is definitely going to be probably the most interesting roster battle as camp goes on. And, just to sort of see which of those guys stand out. Riley O'Brien is a guy who in the early going definitely popped in live BP the other day. A guy whose stuff really stood out and really caught the notice of a lot of people. But that's, again, that's now. We'll see what Nick Robertson looks like when he gets game reps, and Fernandez and all these guys. So they're all going to have opportunities to catch up. But, in terms of who had the best first live VP of camp, it would I guess be Riley O'Brien.
Yeah, so going off that, the spring training games are going to be starting up next weekend. So who are some players that you think fans should be watching as soon as the games begin that we maybe haven't heard about?
Yeah, so I would start with those. I would start with those bullpen guys, right? Robertson, O'Brien, John King. You've seen Palante. You've seen those guys come in with incumbency. Fernandez obviously has the Rule 5 attachment to him. How much they value that? How much can a guy like Granillo, establish himself in camp? A guy who's got a super high strikeout rate and is, 24 and a pure reliever. That's the kind of guy who moves sort of fast, right? So that, maybe that's the guy that you want to keep an eye on. Other than that, the other thing I think that is going to be worth watching is how, what the division of playing time kind of looks like between center field, shortstop, corner, outfield, and how all that works out. For all of the consternation about Tommy Edman this winter, I don't think anybody today is ready to say that he 100% is going to be ready for opening day. He's not swinging at live pitching yet, right? He's hitting off a tee every other day. So even then, there are definite limitations. We've talked to Tommy down here, and for a guy who had what was described to us as a minor surgery, that's an awfully big scar on his wrist. But what do I know? Not a doctor. Whatever, they do what they do. So that is going to be worth watching. When does Tommy Edman get into games, and when he does, is he allowed to swing bat? And if not, then what does that mean for both roster construction and playing time type stuff at the start of the season?
Do you think the center field situation, because Victor Scott's obviously a name that people are really excited about, do you think he would have a real opportunity to insert himself onto the opening day roster if Edman wasn't ready to go? Or do you think that's the more likely scenario is Carlson slides in there, Ciani or Fermin makes the roster, and that's the route they go?
I think that's correct. To me, the comparison to draw is like the spring that Mason Wynn had last year, right? Where Mason got a lot of opportunities to play and got a lot of playing time. But I don't think anybody ever felt like Mason was really in danger / had the real opportunity to make the roster out of spring. I think that is a pretty fair comparison to draw for the spring that we're going to probably see Victor Scott here have over the next couple of weeks.
All right. Well, one more thing I was just wondering here. Sorry, this is a little unrelated, but we've heard all about these pitching Olympics. Guys pick their teams and go through a bunch of events. I think that's what they call it. Has that started yet? And what can you tell us about that?
So I assume we're talking about the PFP championships, right? The draft of guys and all those.
Yeah.
Okay. So that can come and go. That did not happen last. In fact, I'm trying to remember if we've seen it under Ollie Marmol spring training in either the last 2 years. And I'm not entirely sure that we have. There's usually some kind of competitive element. Believe it or not, guys do get bored when they're asked to field the same 8 bunts, for 14 days in a row. So there is, those things do tend to happen. So we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but I will say, they do still get competitive. I was looking at my phone earlier trying to figure out when this terrible rain was going to stop, and noticed that Apple at least thinks it's supposed to be very windy tomorrow. So it will be a fun day to watch pitchers try to field pop-ups out of pop-up machine as the wind blows around. Again, not a coincidence, I'm sure, that you watch a baseball game and pitchers run away from pop-ups on the infield. In spring, they are forced to run to them, and it can be pretty good entertainment.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, who's the spring training? Is it the spring training survivor that you guys play, the Riders down at Jupiter?
Yes, that does happen. We were actually just the other day having a conversation about who was most likely to tread down that path, and I think if I were to be drafting, I would probably be taking like Alfonso Rivas or Jared Young, like 1-2, because those are guys who are going to play or who are at least going to get one at bat in probably basically every game. And they're also not guys who are going to be like held back or, Sajasi maybe may not like be available for every game because maybe he's doing some stuff in minor league camp or whatever, right? As camp goes on, the Rivases and the Youngs of the world, they're going to be in Major League camp kind of right down to the end of it, assuming that they aren't 40-man casualties before then. And so those are guys who to me are probably pretty likely to get into nearly every spring training game.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, to wrap up our conversation today, again, Jeff, thanks for hopping on. We really appreciate it. Speaking of Young, speaking of Rivas, the Cardinals offseason, I think the last time we connected was during the charity live stream. So most of their offseason had been done, but they made some reliever acquisitions by that point. Just kind of reflecting on this winter as a whole, what has been your takeaways from how the Cardinals approach this offseason? And I guess at this point we can put a grade on things a little bit, but where do you think coming into that offseason, where your expectations were and what they finished out with, how do you feel like they did overall?
So what I would say is going into the offseason, if you had shown me what they did, right, I would say that's a pass on a pass-fail scale. In that they did get 3 starters, they got guys they could take innings. The thing that stands out is the very different paths they took between the bullpen and the rotation. They get 3 guys for the rotation who are extremely known quantities. They get 2 guys for the bullpen who are ostensibly known quantities, but also both coming off of injury, right? There is downside to Kittredge and to Middleton both if the health kind of crops up. And then it's just a group of guys who light up the track man, and we'll see if they can pitch, right? Like that, that's the appeal of O'Brien and of Fernandez and of Robertson, these guys that are all going to get lumped together. The Heim bunch, can we call them the Heim bunch? These guys light up the track man, and so that should translate. And will it? We're going to find out. I'm sure at least 1, if not 2 of those guys is going to make the team, and we're going to see what that looks like.
So there's been a little bit of discussion about that the Cardinals they need to make one more move. And we need them to just sign Trevor Rosenthal. And we're just going to manifest that right now.
Sure.
With that out of the way.
I care.
That'd be awesome.
I don't know how much Trevor lights up the TrackMan nowadays, but if if he can still bring it, then hey, what the hell? Everybody look, if the Giants can sign Pablo Sandoval, then Trevor Rosenthal certainly.
Yeah, wild.
Wait,
he's my favorite out there on the free agent market.
The Giants, the Giants, I think it was yesterday, signed Pablo Sandoval to a minor league deal with an NRA, which okay.
He was in the Dubai League.
He was. So, canned, rested, and ready. Which, hey, speaking of right, and speaking of the Giants, if I think Trevor finessed like $20 million out of the Giants and the A's over 2 consecutive years where he didn't throw a pitch for either of them. So good for him. Hey, if he wants to pop back into the minor league deal, I suppose they should allow it.
Well, we'd love to see Trevor. Also, just Jeff, thanks so much for coming on today. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We are just so appreciative of all the support we've gotten, especially over the last few weeks and over this off season. We just absolutely can't wait to get started with the season. And we've got a ton of exciting content coming up for everybody. We were talking about it a bit in the chat earlier, but that video we just released about the 10 most important Cardinals, go check that out. And then we've got some more similar content in the works. We just wanted to tease that. We've also got some new merch. Andrew put some funny merch up on the store. If you want to hold nose water like we do, you can get one of those water bottles, but also check out the rest of our merch. Andrew especially has designed some super cool stuff there. Make sure to keep checking us out on social media at Newt News Pod on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And then anywhere you can listen to your podcasts, check us out. We're on audio platforms as well as YouTube. Make sure to subscribe. That's the most important thing you can do. And then also comment, like, share. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Again, Jeff Jones. Go check his stuff out on Twitter as well. He provides some of the best Cardinals coverage out there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.